It's that time of the year. Your vacation is coming up. You can already hear the beach waves, feel the warm breeze, relax, and think about work. You really, really want it all to work out while you're away. Monday.com gives you and the team that peace of mind. When all work is on one platform and everyone's in sync, things just flow. Wherever you are, tap the banner to go to Monday.com.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II Podcast, episode 477, Who Has Who Surrounded? Last time, on September 14th, 1941, the two Panzer pincers, Guderian from the north and von Kleist from the south, met at Loch Vista, about 110 miles or 177 kilometers east of Kiev, thus closing the escape route of General Kirpanos and his men defending the city. Not that the general and the men under him were going anywhere on the orders of Stalin. One might wonder, what's the difference between dying from a German bullet versus a Russian one? The answer being, of course, that the Russian bullet has comrades, and they may very well visit your family. Or the loved ones may just end up as political prisoners in Siberia. Either way, the stage was set. Kiev was cut off, and no one was coming to help. The trapped men there inside would either hold out or they would not. And though the Germans would come to believe by 1943 that the Russians were not mere mortals, they were, some of them tried to escape this corridor. Those men who had been a part of a now non-existent army or front east of Kiev pushed further east and would not stop until they were stopped. Problem was, the vast majority of them only had small arms, though some were lucky enough to find KV-1 tanks to follow behind. For a few of these tank-led groups, if they came upon unprepared enemy formations, the KV-1s managed to break through the line, dragging a few coat-tail infantrymen with them, making good their escape. But for the majority of them, the Germans had enough warning to bring in their Stuka dive bombers or 88mm flat guns and take out the Russian tanks, and then the infantry went the same way. This process ground down the last of the attempted escapees not within or nearby the city. Meanwhile, Kirpanos had the Soviet 5th, 21st, 26th, and 37th Armies within the Kiev pocket and set up his defenses as best he could. There was no question of breaking out, for Stalin and the Panzers, but simply to deal out as much death as they could before their time came. The Germans, as they had done so many times by this point, let fly with their artillery and Stukas, eliminating the men on the city's outer defensive rings. And as all the airfields within this cauldron were already bombed beyond use, no Soviet planes rose up to challenge them. As the Germans had this down to a science by now, the Stuka dive bombers knew to bomb any woods near major roads, for surely enemy troops would be huddled within. The men on the ground either died or were driven from their hiding place and then strafed. The weakening of the outer defensive rings had begun. As stated, the Russian troops, mostly peasants, were human enough, and they demonstrated this in a second way. Knowing they were going to die, some chose to make any German or Axis POWs pay before they met their end. As some of the SS units moved closer, they came upon a scene that made most of them turn away. And these were men of the SS who generally enjoyed, or at least approved of, visiting suffering on the Third Reich's enemies. One SS unit stopped suddenly and started whispering to each other. The officer in charge did not appreciate this lack of progress and pushed his way to the front. Here's how one other SS officer described the scene. In a small depression covered with apricot trees was a small group of men whispering together. I pushed my way through them and shrank in horror. The small trees were bearing fruit, very strange fruit, that being German soldiers. They were not a pretty sight, with their arms tied high behind them to the weak branches, their jackboots off, and their legs burnt and carbonized up to the knees. So distorted were their faces that even seasoned soldiers had to look away. A few minutes of investigation showed that the Soviet troops had soaked the 102 prisoners' feet in gasoline and then tied them to the trees. Next, their feet were set aflame. This not only produced a slow death, but it was accompanied by intense pain for the duration. In time, for this was not the last that the Germans would see of this done to their men, this would be called Stalin's socks. The SS officer ordered, in reprisal, that all his current Soviet POWs be shot out of hand. For Hitler, this may have been about ridding the world of communism, and for Stalin, about salvaging his great communist experiment, but for those fighting the actual fight, it was quickly becoming about killing as many of the other men as possible, in any way possible. But as the Germans moved in, ever tightening the noose, they found that between the vast area and the rugged terrain, escape avenues still existed. This inflamed many of the SS men who wanted to inflict maximum pain and suffering. Ironically, those Soviet troops that surrendered ended up creating time for others to try to escape, well, at least to try to escape, as the former had to be processed. In another irony, the Russian men who shed their uniforms and put on civilian clothes, most ended up being shot for being suspected partisans. In the end, it's estimated that only about 15,000 Soviet troops and 50 tanks of the former armies east of Kiev successfully made their way out to fight again another day.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
In yet another example of the Soviet fighters being merely men, desperate men, some chose not to fight the Germans, but to join them. After all, wasn't Stalin ordering them to stand and fight until they were all dead? And had not his policies made life even harder for the Ukrainians before this war? No, here was their chance to rid Ukraine of the hated Georgian and Moscow's dominance. A group of about 200 Soviet men had already killed their political commissar, to then escape to the Dnieper River. And once at the Great River, another commissar, this one overseeing an entire division, made contact with these men and tried to talk the privates into joining him to, stay and fight for Mother Russia. But as he spoke, the 200 men listening were getting worked up. Not by his words, or rather the power of his words, but they recognized here was another puppet of the state trying to control them. The highest-ranking officer of this group stood up to the commissar, and for his pains, the political officer pulled out his pistol and shot the man. This made something in the Russian soldiers snap. Before their superior's body hit the ground, they were on the commissar. As one witness put it, in less than a minute, he was torn to pieces. Wars within wars. Yet this was not the only war within this wider war. Now that invaders were here, and it looked as if Stalin's government might fall, to be crushed under a German hill, many in this area saw their opportunity to rid themselves of their oppressors, or at least strike back at those who had taken from them, on the orders of Moscow. Some Soviet troops looking to flee east were fired upon, not by the Germans or political officers, but by local farmers who had guns. In essence, for these men, there was never a moment to relax, for someone in some direction was always trying to kill you. On the other hand, some locals did help those who were trying to retreat. Far away from all this, General Franz Halder, the Chief of Staff of the OKH, or Army High Command, wrote in his diary at this point of the Soviets trying and some succeeding of escaping, enemy formations are bouncing off the encirclement ring like billiard balls. This was not completely true, but it must have seemed so from a distance. Either way, the next step was clear, as this had been done with almost every other pocket thus far. This large pocket would be cut in half by another or second pincer attack from the north and the south. Not only would this make the pockets smaller and thus that much more manageable, but it would cut down on those making good their escape. The German 51st Army Corps advanced south, and the 34th Army Corps moved north to meet up, and their meeting would be complete by September 18th. While this was playing out, that is, the trapped men east of Kiev having their area cleft in twain, the defenses of Kiev itself were penetrated. 2 days before the second pincers met up, on September 16th, the German 71st and the 296th Infantry Divisions led the attack on the city's outer rings. For 3 days, from the 16th to the 19th, these divisions pushed their way through and past Soviet defensive works. The commissars yelled at the men to remain defiant until they lost their voices, so they started playing recordings of Stalin's speeches, as if this would move these men to miracles. To be sure, the German infantry had to fight through the forests around Kiev before the city came into view. As one infantryman would write, then a new tree-covered ridge rose, came into view, and beyond that, we could see what made our hearts beat faster. Kiev's characteristic towers rising clearly in the morning haze. To the right, we could make out the large iron bridge over the Dnieper, and behind it, 2 additional bridges leading out of the center of the city. It was at this point that the professionalism of the German army came to the fore, and it was clearly needed. For the Soviets had dug in well, and even had half-buried some of their tanks to act as pillboxes. The 77th Stug 3 Battalion worked alongside the men of the 95th Infantry, destroying or collapsing bunkers, allowing the 95th to keep moving. The 77th Stug 3 Battalion had 23 Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns for their purpose. The Stug 3 assault gun was the most produced fully tracked armored fighting vehicle the Germans made for the war. The manufacturer, Alket, produced these, and their main factory was in Berlin, so Hitler could keep an eye on it. So picture a Panzer, specifically the Panzer III, but its gun made the difference. Again, the chassis was a modified Panzer III chassis, but its turret was an armored, fixed superstructure with a larger gun, which actually made it cheaper and faster to build. At first, these were expected to be used to support the infantry, and in Kiev's case, they were, but by destroying enemy bunkers. Later, its barrel would be lengthened to better take on the Russian tanks. For now, the Stug 3 could hold 54 rounds, and those rounds were needed, as the Soviets had series and rows of bunkers outside the city for mutual support. But there were times, given the condensed nature of the fighting, that the attacking infantry had to rush at the bunker with demolition charges and flamethrowers. The flames caused the enemy to keep their heads down while demolitions were set. It was time-consuming and dangerous, but the attackers felt that the end was near and thus were motivated to keep going. In a few days' time, when the city limits were breached, the Stug 3 assault guns took on a new role. The German infantry moved forward until resistance was met. If the enemy guns or men could be silenced, this was done. But if the Russians were in a building that proved challenging, then the assault guns would fire high-explosive shells into the base of a structure, and the rest of it would come crashing down on the enemy within. If additional help was needed, then the half-tracks with the MG-34 machine guns would come in, fire on the enemy, again forcing their heads down, but from a safer distance than the flamethrower. Those heads were connected to hands that held anti-tank weapons. The Germans did not need that. The machine guns would fire until the Stug 3s could fire, and that normally ended that particular contest. But even by now, Army Group South like the other two army groups, certainly Army Group Center nearing Moscow, had learned that to use the same tactic over and over against the Russians was a mistake. Yes, many Russians would die, but those that did not would adjust, or at the very least, try something new. It was the same here. So as the fighting got closer to the city's edge, the Germans also had a rolling barrage of heavy artillery, but also smoke, just in front of their men. This took close communication and trust, but by now, the Wehrmacht, again, had this down to a deadly science. Here's how one German infantryman put it. Friendly shells of all calibers were roaring over us. Then our smoke shells were fired. In front of the Bolshevik positions, an enormous smoke screen expanded, as if suddenly a large theater curtain was dropped in front of the enemy. This was the signal for the infantrymen to attack. On one hand, this forced the Soviet gunners to fire blind. On the other, they were well stocked and could afford to keep firing, though a large percentage of their shells missed. Problem was, with all the Soviet casualties thus far, the better-trained forward observers were already dead. Their replacements were learning on the job, if they got enough time to learn. And even here, the cool-headed men of the Wehrmacht watched where the majority of the enemy shells landed and simply stayed away from that area. As the Russian artillery became more desperate, this allowed the German gunners to spot them and fire on their positions. Slowly but surely, the attackers moved forward, with more and more Soviet guns going quiet. As for the defending lines, the political commissars standing right behind the infantry or artillery teams, taking a page from Stalin's book, or more like acting on his orders, shot men in the back who cowered or tried to run. In a sense, the Soviet infantry was being fired on from both sides. But as the Germans came closer, the Soviet infantrymen tried to retreat regardless, but many turning and shooting their commissars first. After the political officer fell, some ran away. Others raised their hands in surrender. Again, this advancement went on for 3 days, the defenders falling back to the city's edge, or dying where they were. When a lead German unit pierced a defensive line, it's not like the men of the line could leave their post and try to help with this breach. To do so would invite other German units to cross over, this time without resistance. Only when an outer ring was shattered would the defenders fall back, sometimes on orders, most times in an attempt to save their own necks. And in war, just like everything else in life, there was a building of a moment, which is when the breakthrough would come, and that happened on September 19th, when Major General Wilhelm Stemmer's men of the 296th Infantry Division broke through the lines that morning north of the city and advanced some 16 miles, or 25 kilometers. Meanwhile, the 95th Infantry Division, assisted by the 99th Rifle Division, was doing the same thing from the south. Now the fighting was on the streets of Kiev. And with their supporting fire from artillery, Stug 3s, flamethrowers, hand grenades, and machine guns, elements of the southern divisions reached Kiev's center at 11 a.m. that September 19th. Soon the Kriegsflag of the Third Reich was raised high. Which is not to say that entire armies were captured along with the city. From early September on, various commanders had been making trips to see Stalin, asking him for permission to evacuate Kiev. It was simply not possible to save it, and so why let all those men be captured? Yet Stalin held his ground, maybe as an example to the men. But like the building of something larger until it gives, the Soviet leader relented during the night of September 17th. But this was not to be a general retreat. Yes, the armies directed by Kurpanos could move east, but to a point just east of the initial pincer meetup between Guderian and von Kleist. A general defensive line was to still be maintained. They were certainly not to head as far east as a Passel River, about 270 miles or 434 kilometers away. Think in between Kursk and Kharkiv. If they went that far, then those troops would not have to worry about being shot by Germans. NKVD men would be pulling the triggers.
Driving plays a big part in driving the local economy. It helps us all get where we're going and creates good jobs close to home. At Synovus Energy, our refineries in Toledo and Lima are a reliable domestic source of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Plus, more than 2,300 employees and contractors work for us here in Ohio. See how we're helping local communities move forward at Synovus.com.
Now, Kirpanos did not technically wait for this order. He guessed something was being discussed, so earlier on September 17th, he ordered the Soviet 5th, 21st, and 37th Armies to attack to the east to punch a hole in the German wall. Meanwhile, the 38th and 40th Armies just outside this wall were to help hold it open. But this was a plan on paper. The Germans were all around, and so no concerted counterattack was carried out as well as desired. Still, the number of Soviet troops pushing their way east overwhelmed parts of the German circle near Rumi, just beyond the German line. And at Rumi was the headquarters of Panzer Group II, Guderian's headquarters. The Red Army in this area came at Rumi with 2 tank brigades, 2 rifle divisions, and 1 cavalry division. And by this time, September 18th, Soviet aircraft had been flown in from further east to dominate the skies over Guderian. For the German general, it went from "let's get ready to celebrate" to "let's call for backup." Around Guderian were only 2 battalions and a scattering of anti-aircraft guns, not enough to head off what was coming. So he requested and received help from part of the Das Reich Division and the 4th Panzer Division. They came from the south, and their counterattack was enough to distract the Soviets. Either way, this was too close for Guderian. He moved his headquarters a few miles to the north. To the southwest of Rumi, the retreating Soviets there beat back the German 35th Infantry Regiment and opened up another hole. Panzers of the 9th Panzer Division would plug this breach, but it would take 2 days. There would be other holes, other temporary defeats of German troops, and even another almost captured commander, that being Lieutenant General Joachim von Kurzfleisch of the 11th Army Corps. In short, it was a moving, chaotic mess, with no one having a firm idea of who was in charge of which area. As one German soldier wrote, often one does not understand who is surrounded, Bolsheviks or us. Thus, the Battle of Kiev was not all that it could have been for the Germans, but more on that in a moment. The Soviets, in leaving the city, left a few parting gifts for the victors. As this war in the East probably seemed like years long already, with many cities falling, the Soviets left explosives in certain places within Kiev, places the Germans were likely to go, like the Arsenal building or the Grand Hotel and other buildings that soon would house German officers. When the Germans entered Kiev that September 19th, they were surprised, but pleased, by so many structures still intact. They chalked it up to the Russians having to flee so quickly, and probably laughed about it. And yet, that evening, the demolitions started going off. The Grand Hotel soon became a casualty of these delayed explosives, along with an officer of the Wehrmacht General Staff and other troops. Some explosions were meant to start fires, but they did not go off until days later. General Gotthard Heinrici, who would write of this on September 29th, "The kind of warfare we witness here has nothing to do with a decent battle." On that same day, other German officers, in reprisal for the Kiev bombings, would arrange the Babi War massacre, in where some 33,000 Jews were murdered, along with Soviet POWs and others within German control. Back to Kiev, some 200 German soldiers were burnt to death due to incendiary bombs. That fire lasted for 5 days, and at least 670 other incendiary charges were found, many of those by Ukrainians who were glad the Soviets were gone and just wanted their city back. But they would not get it. The Germans could have had an ally here, but treated the Ukrainians as loyal Soviet citizens, something that confused and enraged the locals. The pocket of trapped Soviet troops was divided and divided again. Of the 43 Soviet divisions fighting in the area, most were killed, wounded, or captured. Again, about 15,000 of them made it completely out of the area. As for German casualties, the numbers here are vague at best. Somewhere around 26,000 killed, just shy of 100,000 wounded, and some 5,000 missing. In terms of the wider Eastern Front, Kiev was another, as time would show, Pyrrhic victory. Yes, many Soviet troops were out of the fighting, but the Germans lost too many, considering how much fighting was still left to do. And this was just one of the 3 major fronts. Soviet commanders like Bunyany, Timoshenko, and Khrushchev were able to fly out before the end. Kirponos retreated with the Soviet Fifth Army, but then they were engaged by the 3rd Panzer Division. The Fifth Army commander was captured, and then Kirponos, near the front line, was seriously wounded. He was carried deep into the woods, but the enemy was following. Soon a mortar shell landed close enough to the general to end his life. Now that Kiev was captured, to German thinking, it was time to focus on Moscow. However, sending Army Group Center panzers like Guderian's to assist had cost the delay of a month, time that could have been spent pushing on towards Moscow. On that note, Guderian now ordered his panzers of Panzer Group 2 to turn to the northeast and move out. It was Moscow's turn. As for Army Group South, it would continue its way east, taking the industrial area near Kharkov, but not Kharkov itself. It would move on and win the Crimea, but there was never enough of anything, everything, to keep moving. Not enough panzers, planes, men, or fuel. How do you defeat an enemy that will not admit defeat? Postscript. To be sure, mistakes were made by Berlin and Moscow. On one hand, Stalin, in ordering those troops to remain, lost them with little to show for it. In other words, bad generalship. But Stalin was not a general. He was a dictator, willing to sacrifice all and everyone for his sake. And Hitler held up the attack on Moscow to finish off Kiev. Who could say what would have happened had he kept Army Group Center's panzers in place and let them move on to Moscow, which was Soviet Russia's main hub? Either way, this delay gave Stalin time to recover from some of his earlier mistakes. As for Hitler, he felt that the fall of Kiev was the beginning of the end of Stalin's Russia. He told his generals, "I declare today, and I declare it without reservation, the enemy in the east has been struck down and will never rise again." This was not only due to the capture of Kiev, but during the 8 weeks of fighting for that city, Army Group Center had time to recover by resting their men, building up their supplies, and, equally important, allowing the infantry to catch up to where the panzers would start their next thrust. But like the disastrous losses of paratroops during the Battle of Crete, which affected Malta, the Battle of Kiev altered Hitler's thinking in taking major cities like Leningrad and Moscow. The explosives left behind in Kiev made the Führer blink. From now on, large fortified cities were not to be directly attacked. No, they were to be surrounded, besieged by artillery and air attacks, and left to starve. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So we are back from our trip celebrating Kiki's high school graduation. Had a lot of fun. You can see some of the photos. I put them up on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook under the World War II page, if you are so inclined. while I was gone, which was 2.5 weeks, maybe it's me because I'm still 7 hours ahead of time, but I can't sleep and I'm really messed up, still trying to adjust. I don't know if Gmail did something weird, so I want to make sure I didn't miss anybody as far as those who have donated or are members. So I'm going to do a list. I might be doubling up, but I want to play it safe. So let's see here. Some of the latest members who have joined up, and they get at least 2 episodes a month, kind of behind the stories. Let's see here. Matthew Morris, Carl Rudd, Samuel Zitlecht, Adam Durzok, Wayne Hansen, sorry about that, Wayne, John Haskell, and Porter Sago. As far as those who have donated, let's see here. Buck Brandt, which is the coolest freaking name in the world. Robert Gates, John Fowler, Brandon Hilton, good name. Jack Hines, Dale Wyckoff, Samuel Licht again, so he donated and became a member. Thank you, Samuel. Bruce Anthony, Tabor Cummings, Stuart Mungo, Brian Mitchell, George Brandt, Christopher Tabor, William Yon, and Brad Wolf. So again, I probably said some of those names, but I just want to be sure. Thank you so much for your patience. We are now, I'm reading a whole bunch of stuff about the early phase of the attack on Moscow, so I might maybe do one more standalone episode. I'm thinking about maybe the internment of Japanese citizens, American Japanese citizens after Pearl Harbor. I'm not sure yet. We'll see how it goes because I don't want to wait too long to get the next episode out. But then we will jump into the meat of Barbarossa, the fighting for Moscow. Take care, everyone. And I'm going to go get some sleep.